haunting of room 104. It was 1987, and James, a history professor in his early 30s, checked into a small, historic inn for a weekend conference. The inn, tucked away in a quiet New England town, was old, so old that creaky floorboards and dimly lit hallways gave the building an air of mystery. James didn't mind, though. He liked the quiet, and the thought of staying in a place with so much history was almost thrilling. At the reception desk, the elderly innkeeper handed him his key with a hesitant smile. "Room 104, she murmured. "It's a fine room, though some guests have found it." James brushed off her hesitation, eager to settle in and get some rest. He climbed the narrow staircase, feeling the wood creak beneath his feet, and made his way down a hallway dimly illuminated by flickering wall sconces. Room 104 waited at the end of the hall. When he unlocked the door, he found a simple, quaint room. A bed covered with a lace quilt, a wooden dresser, and a small window with heavy curtains that blocked the evening light. He unpacked his things, letting the stillness of the room wash over him. But as night fell, James began to feel an odd tension in the air. It was a strange sensation, as if he was not alone. The feeling crept over him slowly, settling into his bones. He brushed it off as just nerves from the upcoming conference. Sometime around midnight, he awoke with a start. The room was pitch black, save for a faint strip of moonlight that had managed to slip through the thick curtains. He tried to shake off the feeling and turned on his side, determined to fall back asleep. Then he heard it, the softest whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from the far corner of the room. His heart began to race as he strained his ears, hoping it was just the wind outside. But the whisper grew louder, forming faint words that he couldn't quite make out. "Leave." The voice was gentle, almost pleading, yet chilling enough to make his hair stand on end. He held his breath, not daring to move. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whisper stopped, leaving the room in absolute silence. James wanted to believe he'd imagined it, but a cold draft brushed against his skin, even though the window was tightly shut. Fighting a sense of dread, he switched on the bedside lamp and glanced around, searching for any explanation. The room looked exactly as it had when he'd first arrived, empty, quiet, and completely normal. The next day, he decided not to mention anything to the innkeeper, convincing himself it had been a trick of his exhausted mind. But as he attended the conference and spoke to the other attendees, he couldn't shake the memory of that whisper. On the second night, he returned to room 104 and cautiously locked the door. He left the light on this time, hoping that a little brightness would keep the eerie feelings at bay. But as the night wore on, fatigue crept in, and he eventually drifted off to sleep. Around the same time as the previous night, he awoke again, but this time with a distinct sense of dread. It wasn't just a whisper this time. It was a faint but unmistakable pressure on the edge of his bed, as if someone was sitting there, watching him. Paralyzed with fear, he couldn't bring himself to turn and look. He lay there, listening to his heartbeat echo in the stillness. Then the whisper began again, clearer than before. "Please leave. You don't belong here." The urgency in the voice shook him. Gathering every ounce of courage, he turned on the light and looked around. Nothing. The room was empty, the door still locked. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and a chill filled the air. The next morning, exhausted and rattled, he decided to speak to the innkeeper. When he mentioned the odd occurrences, she gave him a sad, understanding smile. "You're not the first, you know. Room 104 has a story of its own." She went on to tell him that years ago, A young man had checked into that very room, traveling on a business trip, but he had never checked out. They'd found him the next morning, a note left on the desk saying he could no longer bear the weight of his sorrows. Since then, guests who stayed in room 104 sometimes reported whispers and an unsettling presence. James felt a strange mixture of relief and empathy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the room held something unfinished. He checked out of the inn that morning, leaving the quiet, haunting history of room 104 behind. Years later, whenever James recalls his stay at that inn, a shiver runs down his spine. He still doesn't know what or who visited him those 2 nights, but the memory of that quiet, pleading whisper lingers in his mind, a reminder that sometimes the past is never really gone.